Hey everyone, tonight we delve into the darkest chapter of Targaryen rule, the reign of a king so corrupt, so utterly destructive, that history itself would brand him with a name that echoes through the ages. Aegon IV, Aegon the Unworthy. A man whose appetites were so boundless that he would tear apart the very realm he was sworn to protect, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and betrayal. But before we descend into this tale of royal corruption and the slow poisoning of a kingdom, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the shadows of Westeros. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore these ancient mysteries together. Now get comfortable under your covers. Maybe let that gentle background noise settle your mind, and let's ease into tonight's epic journey through one of the most consequential reigns in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Because what you're about to hear isn't just the story of one man's fall into darkness. It's the tale of how a single king's insatiable hunger for pleasure and power would plant the seeds of civil war that would ravage Westeros for generations. How royal bastards bearing the dragon's blood would rise up with fire and sword. How the very legitimacy of the Iron Throne itself would be called into question. In the great halls of the Red Keep, servants still whisper of the nights when King Aegon would stumble through the corridors, wine-stained and bloated, searching for his next conquest. They speak of Queen Nerys, the saint-like sister he married and tormented, whose tears seemed to echo through the castle walls. Of Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight, the most perfect knight who ever lived, caught in an impossible web of duty and forbidden love. Of chambers where illegitimate children were born in shadows, each one carrying the potential to shatter kingdoms. But perhaps most chilling of all, they remember his final act. As death finally claimed the unworthy king, as his bloated form lay dying upon his bed, he would speak words that would doom the realm to decades of bloodshed. With his final breath, he would legitimize every bastard he had ever sired, transforming stable succession into chaotic warfare. A dying king's spite would birth the Blackfire pretenders, and the realm would bleed for it. Yet here lies the mystery that has puzzled maesters and historians for centuries. How did such a weak, corrupt king manage to hold the throne for over a decade? How did the Seven Kingdoms not collapse under the weight of his appetites and scandals? What dark forces and hidden loyalties kept the realm from exploding into open rebellion while he lived? The answer, as you'll discover, lies buried beneath layers of court intrigue, sexual politics, and the strange magic that surrounds the Targaryen bloodline. For Aegon the Unworthy was not merely a fat king who loved wine and women. He was something far more dangerous. A man who understood exactly how to use corruption as a weapon, how to bind the great lords to him through their own shameful complicity. Tonight we'll witness how a prince became a monster, how a kingdom slowly poisoned itself from within, and how the choices made in royal bedchambers would echo across centuries of warfare. We'll see bastards born who would reshape the map of Westeros, marriages that became prisons, and knights whose honor would be tested beyond all breaking points. This is the story of how desire destroys kingdoms, how unchecked power corrupts absolutely, and how sometimes the greatest threats to a realm come not from foreign enemies or natural disasters, but from the appetites of the men who sit upon the throne. So settle back now, let the darkness gather around you like a warm embrace, and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of royal darkness. The tale of Aegon the Unworthy awaits, and with it, the terrible knowledge of how easily kingdoms fall when their kings forget that crowns are meant to serve something greater than the men who wear them. The dragons are stirring in the deep places of memory, and their shadows are long indeed. In the year 172 after Aegon's conquest, as autumn settled over King's Landing like a golden shroud, The Iron Throne passed to a prince who had spent his entire life preparing not for kingship but for indulgence. The Red Keep, that ancient fortress of red stone perched high above Blackwater Bay, had seen many kings ascend its steps to claim the crown, but none quite like Prince Aegon IV of his name, who would transform those hallowed halls into something approaching a brothel draped in royal silk. The throne room itself seemed to sense the change. Where once King Bagula the Blessed had held court with humble piety, where the wise Viserys II had dispensed careful justice just months before, now sat a man whose very presence seemed to make the ancient swords of the Iron Throne glisten with something that might have been anticipation, or perhaps dread. The throne had tasted the blood of unworthy kings before, but rarely one so determined to test its patience. Aegon IV was, in his youth, what court ladies might have generously called handsome in a rough, brutal sort of way. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the classic Targaryen features of silver-gold hair and purple eyes, he possessed the kind of physical presence that commanded attention in any room. But even then, there was something unsettling about his gaze, something that lingered too long on serving girls and lords' daughters alike. His smile, when it came, never quite reached those violet eyes, and his laugh carried undertones that made wise mothers pull their daughters a little closer. But it was not his appearance that would define his reign. It was his appetites. Appetites that seemed to grow larger and more demanding with each passing day, as if the crown itself had awakened some sleeping hunger within him. Wine flowed like water in his presence. Feasts stretched from dusk till dawn, and the very air in the Red Keep grew thick with the scent of excess and barely concealed scandal. The king's apartments, once austere chambers befitting a ruler's dignity, were transformed into something resembling a sultan's palace. Rich Moorish carpets covered every surface. Lycian silks draped the walls in deep purples and golds, and the furniture groaned under the weight of precious objects, acquired not through trade or diplomacy, but as gifts from those seeking to curry favor with increasingly creative offerings. The royal bedchamber, in particular, became the subject of whispered speculation throughout the castle, its door seemingly revolving with a parade of visitors who entered with hope and left with gold, or shame, or sometimes both. Yet for all his personal corruption, Aegon was not a fool. He understood power in ways that his pious brother Badola never had, grasped the intricate web of loyalties and fears that held the Seven Kingdoms together. Where Badola had tried to rule through divine inspiration and Viserys through careful wisdom, Aegon chose a different path entirely. He would rule through desire, through the careful cultivation of dependencies and compromises that would bind the great houses to him, not through love or respect, but through mutual corruption. But in this den of royal vice, three figures stood apart, creating a triangle of tension that would define not just the reign, but the entire future of the Targaryen dynasty. First was Queen Nerys, Aegon's sister-wife, a woman so ethereally beautiful and painfully devout that she seemed to float through the Red Keep like a living saint trapped in hell, pale as fresh snow, with silver hair that caught the light like spun moonbeams, and eyes the color of amethysts. She possessed a fragile, otherworldly beauty that made hardened knights weep and inspired bards to compose songs of impossible longing. Yet this beauty was her curse as much as her blessing, for it had bound her in marriage to a brother who saw her not as a wife to be cherished, but as a possession to be owned and displayed. Nerys had entered marriage as a girl of deep faith and innocent hopes, believing perhaps that love might bloom between them as it had for some of their ancestors. Instead, she found herself trapped with a husband whose idea of marital affection was to parade his mistresses before her eyes, to force her to smile and curtsy to the women who shared his bed while she prayed alone in cold chambers. The marriage chamber became her prison, each royal duty a torment, each pregnancy a desperate hope that perhaps this child might somehow bridge the growing chasm between them. She spent her days in the castle sept, kneeling before carved representations of the Seven, her whispered prayers echoing off stone walls that seemed to absorb her suffering without offering relief. The courtiers learned to recognize the signs of her distress, the way her already pale complexion would become translucent when Aegon's latest scandal reached her ears, the trembling of her delicate hands when she was forced to acknowledge his bastards with royal politeness. The second figure in this tragic triangle was Prince Aemon, called the Dragon Knight, Aegon's younger brother and the finest knight the realm had ever known. Where Aegon was crude and grasping, Aemon embodied every virtue that songs celebrated and young squires dreamed of achieving. His skill with sword and lance was legendary throughout the Seven Kingdoms, but it was his perfect honor, his absolute dedication to duty and chivalry, that made him shine like a beacon in the increasingly dark court of his brother. Tall and lean with the same silver-gold hair as his siblings, Aemon carried himself with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, but it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Where Aegon's gaze held hunger and calculation, Aemon's held compassion and an almost painful integrity. He served as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the youngest man ever to hold that position, and wore the white cloak with a dignity that seemed to elevate everyone around him. But even the perfect knight was not immune to the corrupting influence of his brother's court, though his corruption took a different form entirely. For Aemon the Dragon Knight loved Queen Nerys with a devotion that went far beyond brotherly affection or knightly protection. It was a love that consumed him, that turned his greatest virtue into his most dangerous weakness, and that would ultimately threaten the very foundations of royal legitimacy. The third member of this triangle was Aegon himself, who seemed to take perverse pleasure in the suffering his behavior caused his wife, and the impossible position it created for his honor-bound brother. He was not blind to the looks that passed between Nerys and Aemon, not ignorant of the way his brother's jaw tightened when forced to escort the queen to yet another feast, where she would be subjected to fresh humiliations. Indeed, Aegon seemed to encourage the tension, to feed off it like some great bloated spider at the center of a web of emotional torment. And watching it all from the shadows were the bastards. The transformation of Prince Aegon into the monster history would remember began not with his coronation, but in the months that followed his father's sudden death. Viserys II had ruled for barely a year, but in that brief time he had surrounded himself with capable advisors, maintained the careful balance between the great houses, and preserved the dignity that the Iron Throne demanded. His death came swiftly, some whispered too swiftly, leaving behind a realm that functioned like a finely crafted timepiece. Aegon's first act as king was to dismantle that timepiece with the enthusiasm of a child breaking toys. The morning after his coronation, as the great lords of Westeros still nursed their wine-heavy heads from the celebration feast, Aegon summoned his father's council to the throne room. Lord Bracken, who had served faithfully as Hand, arrived expecting to discuss the transition of power, the pressing matters of state that required immediate attention. Instead, he found himself facing a king who had already decided that his father's way of ruling was far too restrictive for a man of true Targaryen blood. The dismissal was brutal in its casualness. Aegon sprawled across the Iron Throne with the lazy confidence of a cat in sunlight, barely looked up from the Dornish wine he was savoring as he stripped Lord Bracken of his position. There would be no explanations, no gratitude for years of faithful service, no acknowledgement of the delicate political relationships that Bracken had carefully cultivated. Simply a wave of the royal hand and the installation of lesser men whose primary qualification seemed to be their willingness to smile and nod at whatever their new king desired. But it was in the private chambers of the Red Keep, away from the formal ceremonies and public declarations, that Aegon truly began to reveal the depths of his appetites. The royal apartments, which had been his father's sanctuary of quiet contemplation, became something altogether different under Aegon's influence. Where Viserys had kept a modest household staff, Aegon began to surround himself with a carefully selected collection of serving girls, each chosen not for their skill at domestic duties, but for qualities that had nothing to do with running a royal household. The king's tastes, it became clear, ran toward variety and novelty. A Dornish girl with olive skin and dark eyes might catch his fancy for a week, only to be replaced by a fair-haired daughter of the Reach, whose innocence seemed to intrigue him. Serving wenches from the kitchens found themselves summoned to pour wine at intimate dinners, then discovered that their duties extended far beyond anything they might have expected when they first sought employment in the castle. Yet even as Aegon indulged these appetites, he demonstrated a cunning that his critics would consistently underestimate. Each seduction was calculated, each affair designed to create bonds of complicity with the families involved. A lord who might object to royal excess would find his protests muted when his own daughter had shared the king's bed and received a generous purse for her services. A knight who questioned the king's judgment would discover that his sister had been granted a minor position at court, one that came with certain unspoken expectations. This was not mere lust, though lust certainly drove much of what Aegon did. This was the systematic corruption of the nobility, the creation of a web of shared guilt and mutual benefit that would make opposition to his rule not just difficult, but personally costly for anyone who dared attempt it. Every feast became an opportunity for recruitment, every royal progress a chance to expand his network of compromised allies. Queen Naris watched this transformation with growing horror. In the early days of their marriage, she had harbored hopes that perhaps motherhood might change her husband, that the birth of Prince Daeron might awaken some paternal instinct that would temper his excesses. Instead, she discovered that Aegon viewed fatherhood as simply another opportunity for indulgence. The same appetites that drove him to seek pleasure with serving girls and minor nobles' daughters also led him to use his own son as a political tool, a symbol of dynasty that justified whatever behavior the king chose to pursue. The queen's prayers in the royal sept became longer, more desperate. She would kneel before the carved face of the mother, seeking strength to endure another day in a court that seemed to celebrate the very sins that her faith taught were damnable. The other noble ladies who attended her began to notice the way her hands would shake when she embroidered, the way her voice would catch when she was forced to greet yet another of her husband's conquests with royal courtesy. Prince Aemon found himself in an impossible position. As Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, he had sworn sacred oaths to protect the royal family, to guard the king's life with his own if necessary. But those same vows required him to stand silently as his brother systematically destroyed everything that their house had spent generations building. The white cloak that should have been a symbol of honor began to feel like a shroud, binding him to a king whose behavior made a mockery of every principle that the Kingsguard was supposed to embody. The breaking point came during what would later be remembered as the Feast of Fools, though no fool had planned it. Aegon had decided to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of his coronation with a gathering that would demonstrate his power over the great houses. Lords and ladies from across the 7 kingdoms were summoned to King's Landing, ostensibly to renew their oaths of fealty, but actually to participate in what amounted to a royal orgy disguised as a state function. The feast itself was magnificent in its excess. Tables groaned under the weight of swan and peacock. Rare wines from across the narrow sea flowed like rivers, and entertainment was provided by performers whose acts grew increasingly scandalous as the evening progressed. But it was what happened after the formal dinner that truly revealed the depths of Aegon's corruption. As the wine took hold and inhibitions fell away, the king began to orchestrate what he called games. Noble ladies found themselves participating in contests that would have been shocking in a brothel, while their husbands watched with frozen smiles, knowing that objection would mean political suicide. Knights who had spent their lives upholding codes of chivalry discovered that those codes meant nothing when the king commanded them to participate in activities that mocked everything they had sworn to protect. The Aemon stood in the shadows of the throne room, his white cloak feeling heavier with each passing moment, watching his king transform the very seat of royal power into something that defiled everything their ancestors had built. When a young maiden, barely 16 and clearly terrified, was brought forward to participate in one of Aegon's games, something inside the Dragon Knight finally snapped. But even as his hand moved instinctively toward his sword, even as every fiber of his being screamed for justice, Aemon remembered his vows. The king's life was sacred, no matter how he chose to live it. The realm's stability depended on the sanctity of the crown, regardless of who wore it. And so the greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms stood paralyzed by his own honor, forced to watch as his brother's appetites devoured everything noble about their bloodline. That night marked the true beginning of Aegon's reign of corruption, the moment when even those closest to him realized that there would be no limits to his appetites, no boundaries that his hunger would respect. The great lords returned to their castles with stories that would be whispered about for generations, carrying with them the knowledge that the Iron Throne was occupied by a man who viewed the entire realm as his personal pleasure garden. And in the shadows of the Red Keep, plans began to form. Not plans for rebellion, for Aegon was still too powerful and too cunning for open opposition, but plans for survival, for protection, for ways to navigate a court where virtue had become a liability and corruption the only path to royal favor. The age of Aegon the Unworthy had truly begun, and with it the slow poisoning of everything the Targaryens had built since the conquest. With the foundations of his corrupt court firmly established, King Aegon turned his attention to what he considered the true business of kingship. The systematic exploitation of every privilege and power that the Iron Throne could provide. The Red Keep, once a symbol of Targaryen majesty and strength, began to take on the atmosphere of a pleasure palace, where the only law was the king's desire, and the only currency was the willingness to participate in his increasingly elaborate games of power and submission. The first indication that Aegon's reign would be different from anything Westeros had experienced came with his decision to restructure the entire royal household. Where previous kings had maintained a careful balance between efficiency and ceremony, surrounding themselves with servants chosen for their competence and discretion, Aegon began to populate the castle with individuals selected for entirely different criteria. Young women of uncommon beauty found themselves appointed to positions that had traditionally been held by older, more experienced servants. Kitchen maids discovered that their duties now included serving wine at private dinners in the king's chambers. Seamstresses were asked to take measurements for garments that seemed designed more for removal than for wear. But Aegon was not content to limit his corruption to the castle staff. He understood that true power lay in binding the great houses to his will, and he set about this task with the methodical patience of a master craftsman. The key was to make his debauchery seem not like weakness, but like strength. To transform his appetites into demonstrations of royal prerogative that the nobility would be forced to not only tolerate but celebrate. His first target was House Blackwood of Raventry Hall, one of the most ancient and proud families in the Riverlands. Lady Melissa Blackwood was everything that Aegon found irresistible in a woman, young and beautiful certainly, but more importantly, she was the daughter of a house that had never bent easily to royal will. Her seduction would not be merely a personal conquest, but a political statement that even the most prideful families would eventually submit to Targaryen power. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a masterpiece of calculated manipulation. Aegon did not simply summon Melissa to his bed like some common serving girl. Instead, he invited her family to court, showered them with honors and gifts, made Lord Blackwood feel like a valued advisor whose counsel was essential to the realm's welfare. The king attended to Melissa with the elaborate courtesy that might be shown to a potential queen, writing her poetry that was actually quite good, commissioning musicians to compose songs in her honor, presenting her with jewels that would have been appropriate wedding gifts for a princess. When she finally came to his bed, It seemed to the court like the natural culmination of a great romance rather than the calculated seduction it actually was. Lady Melissa became the king's first acknowledged mistress, installed in apartments that rivaled the queen's own chambers in their luxury. She held court of her own, receiving petitions from minor nobles, dispensing small favors, and gradually assuming many of the ceremonial duties that Queen Nashris found too painful to perform. The arrangement suited everyone except the queen herself. Lord Blackwood found his family's influence at court elevated beyond anything they had enjoyed in generations. The other great houses saw that collaboration with the king's appetites brought rewards rather than shame. Even the small folk seemed to approve, viewing the king's obvious virility as a sign of strength and his generosity toward his mistress as evidence of a passionate nature that was preferable to the cold piety that had marked some previous reigns. Queen Nashris retreated further into her faith, spending entire days in the sept, emerging only for the most essential royal functions. When forced to appear at court, she carried herself with a dignity that was heartbreaking in its quiet desperation. She would smile when protocol demanded it, curtsy to her husband's mistress when etiquette required it, and maintain the facade of a happy royal marriage, even as everyone present knew that her heart was breaking with each public humiliation. Prince Aemon watched his sister-in-law suffering with growing anguish. As Lord Commander of the King's Guard, he was required to be present at most court functions, to stand silently in his white cloak, while his king openly celebrated his adultery. The code of chivalry that had guided Aemon's entire life demanded that he protect innocent women from harm, yet his sworn oaths bound him to protect the very man who was causing the greatest harm to the woman he was beginning to love with a devotion that terrified him. The Dragon Knight began to spend more time with the Queen, ostensibly in his role as her protector, but actually because her presence was the only thing that brought him peace in a court that seemed designed to mock everything he believed in. Their conversations, always carefully chaperoned and scrupulously proper, became the highlight of both their days. Nashris found in Aemon a reminder that nobility and honor still existed somewhere in the world, while Aemon discovered that his feelings for his brother's wife went far beyond duty or sympathy. Their growing closeness did not escape Aegon's notice. The king seemed amused rather than threatened by the obvious affection between his wife and his brother. In his twisted understanding of human nature, he viewed their relationship as simply another form of entertainment, a living drama that played out for his enjoyment. He began to engineer situations that would force them together, then watched with evident pleasure as they struggled to maintain proper distance, while their feelings for each other became increasingly obvious to everyone at court. This was perhaps the most revealing aspect of Aegon's character. He was not driven by simple lust or even by a desire for power in its traditional forms. What truly excited him was the corruption of innocence, the transformation of virtue into complicity. He took genuine pleasure in forcing good people to compromise their principles, in creating situations where honorable individuals were forced to choose between their ideals and their survival. The court began to reshape itself around these dynamics. Nobles who had initially been scandalized by the king's behavior gradually found themselves participating in it, either directly or through their silent acceptance. Ladies who had once been horrified by the idea of adultery began to compete for positions as potential royal mistresses, understanding that such status could elevate their entire families. Knights who had sworn oaths of chivalry discovered that those oaths meant less than royal favor when it came to advancement and reward. But perhaps most significantly, the king began to surround himself with individuals who shared his appetites rather than those who might restrain them. His new advisors were chosen not for their wisdom or experience, but for their willingness to facilitate whatever the king desired. Men who might have once served as the royal conscience were replaced by others who viewed their primary duty as the satisfaction of royal pleasure. This transformation of the royal court had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the Red Keep. The great houses, watching from their distant castles, began to understand that the rules of the game had changed fundamentally. Virtue and honor, the traditional currencies of noble interaction, had been devalued in favor of more pragmatic considerations. Families that had built their reputations on generations of faithful service found themselves at a disadvantage compared to those willing to offer their daughters as tribute to royal appetites. And in the shadows of this transformed court, watching everything with calculating eyes, were the king's bastards, born of his various liaisons, growing up in the peculiar environment that Aegon had created. These children began to understand from their earliest years that their father's weaknesses might someday become their strengths, that his corruption of the traditional order might create opportunities for those clever enough to seize them. The journey into darkness had begun in earnest, and there would be no turning back. 3 years into his reign, King Aegon had perfected the art of ruling through carefully orchestrated scandal. What had begun as personal indulgence had evolved into something far more sophisticated, a system of governance based on the systematic corruption of the very foundations that had held the Seven Kingdoms together for over a century and a half. The Red Keep hummed with secrets, each more damaging than the last, yet somehow the realm continued to function with an efficiency that puzzled even Aegon's harshest critics. The discovery of how this was possible began with a series of seemingly unconnected observations that gradually revealed the true genius behind Aegon's apparent madness. Lord Butterwell, one of the few honest men remaining on the small council, began to notice patterns in the king's behavior that suggested a level of calculation that went far beyond simple hedonism. Every scandal seemed to serve multiple purposes, every outrage carefully timed to achieve maximum political effect. Take the matter of Lady Melissa Blackwood's sudden elevation to unofficial queen. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than a powerful man indulging his appetites at the expense of his lawful wife. But a closer examination revealed layers of political maneuvering that were breathtaking in their complexity. By choosing a Blackwood as his first acknowledged mistress, Aegon had effectively neutralized one of the most potentially troublesome houses in the Riverlands. Lord Blackwood, who might have been expected to object strenuously to his daughter's dishonor, instead found himself bound to the crown by bonds stronger than traditional loyalty. The genius lay in how Aegon had structured the arrangement. Rather than simply taking what he wanted by force, he had made the Blackwoods complicit in their own corruption. They had accepted the gifts, participated in the elaborate courtship rituals, and eventually given their blessing to a relationship that elevated their status even as it compromised their honor. Now they were not victims of royal tyranny, but willing participants in royal excess, which made them far more valuable as allies and far less likely to become enemies. But the Blackwood affair was only the beginning. As Lord Butterwell continued his quiet investigation into the king's methods, he began to uncover a web of similar arrangements that extended throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Every great house seemed to have some connection to the royal court that went beyond traditional feudal obligations. Daughters served as ladies-in-waiting under circumstances that suggested their duties extended far beyond normal court service. Sons received positions and honors that seemed disproportionate to their qualifications. Marriages were arranged between houses in patterns that created new networks of obligation and mutual dependence. The king's progresses, those traditional royal journeys that allowed monarchs to show themselves to their people and renew bonds with distant lords, had been transformed under Aegon's rule into something that resembled a conquering army of seduction. When the royal party arrived at a castle, it brought with it an atmosphere of celebration and excess that seemed to infect everyone it touched. Local daughters who caught the king's eye found themselves showered with attention and gifts. Their families, initially scandalized, gradually came to see the royal interest as an opportunity rather than a disgrace. Queen Nerys had begun to notice these patterns as well, though from a perspective of growing horror rather than political admiration. She saw how her husband's appetites were systematically destroying the moral foundations of noble society. creating a generation of lords and ladies who valued advancement over honor, who saw virtue as a luxury they could no longer afford in a court where compliance with royal vice was the price of survival. The Queen's attempts to maintain some semblance of traditional values had become increasingly desperate. She established charitable foundations that provided for the children of servants who had been dismissed from royal service, understanding without being told why so many young women had suddenly found themselves unemployed. She increased her own religious observances, hoping that her public piety might serve as a counterweight to her husband's equally public debauchery. She even attempted to create alternative court entertainments, gatherings focused on music and poetry rather than the increasingly elaborate games that Aegon preferred. But every effort she made seemed only to highlight the contrast between what the court had been and what it was becoming. Her charitable works drew attention to the casualties of her husband's reign. Her religious devotions made her seem like a relic from a more innocent age. Her attempts to promote wholesome entertainment were politely attended and quickly forgotten, overshadowed by the far more exciting diversions that the king provided. Prince Aemon found himself in an even more impossible position. As Lord Commander of the King's Guard, he was privy to information that revealed the true scope of his brother's activities. He knew about the secret payments to families whose daughters had served the king's pleasure. He was aware of the political arrangements that had been negotiated in royal bedchambers. He understood how the traditional systems of justice and governance were being replaced by networks of personal obligation and mutual compromise. The Dragon Knight had always believed that honor was its own reward, that doing right was sufficient justification for any sacrifice. But watching his brother's corrupt system actually succeed in maintaining peace and prosperity throughout the realm forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of effective rule. Was a just king who allowed the realm to slide into chaos more moral than a corrupt king who maintained stability? Did the nobility have a right to their traditional privileges if they were willing to abandon their traditional responsibilities? These philosophical struggles were complicated by his growing feelings for Queen Nerys. What had begun as sympathy for her suffering had evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. Armin found himself looking forward to their conversations with an intensity that troubled him. He began to seek out opportunities to spend time in her presence, always maintaining scrupulous propriety, but knowing that his motivations went far beyond his duty to protect the royal family. The Queen, for her part, seemed to find in Aemon's company the only refuge from the nightmare that her life had become. When they walked together in the Godswood, discussing philosophy or history, or the simple pleasures of poetry, she could almost forget the humiliations that awaited her return to the Red Keep. When he escorted her to court functions, his presence at her side made it possible to endure the sight of her husband's latest conquest, wearing jewels that should have belonged to the lawful queen. But their growing closeness was noticed by others, particularly by King Aegon himself. Rather than being threatened by the obvious affection between his wife and his brother, the king seemed amused by it. He began to make comments that suggested he was fully aware of their feelings, jokes that forced them to acknowledge their attraction while simultaneously making it clear that he considered their restraint more entertaining than any physical relationship might have been. This reaction revealed another aspect of Aegon's twisted psychology. He was not jealous in any conventional sense, because he did not truly value his wife as a person. She was a possession, a symbol of his royal status, and like all his possessions, she existed primarily for his amusement. If she found happiness with his brother, that happiness would only be meaningful if it served his purposes. If their love caused them suffering, that suffering was simply another form of entertainment. The court began to realize that they were living under a king who viewed human emotion as a form of theater performed for his benefit. Every relationship, every alliance, every moment of joy or sorrow was material for his endless appetite for psychological manipulation. Noble families who had initially believed they could navigate his reign by simply avoiding his attention discovered that anonymity was not an option. Everyone would be forced to play a role in the great drama of his rule, whether as willing participants or unwilling victims. And as this understanding spread through the corridors of the Red Keep, as lords and ladies began to grasp the true nature of the game they were being forced to play, the first whispers of genuine fear began to be heard. For they were beginning to realize that Aegon IV was not simply a weak king with strong appetites. He was something far more dangerous, a monarch who had discovered how to use human weakness as a tool of statecraft, and who showed no signs of being satisfied with anything less than the complete transformation of everything their world had once held sacred. By the 5th year of his reign, many observers, both within the Red Keep and throughout the Seven Kingdoms, had begun to develop what seemed like a reasonable explanation for the paradox of Aegon's rule. Here was a king whose personal behavior was scandalous beyond anything in living memory, yet the realm prospered under his governance in ways that confounded his critics and surprised even his supporters. The harvests were good, trade flourished, and the great houses remained loyal despite their private reservations about royal conduct. The explanation that gained currency among the maesters and the more thoughtful lords was elegantly simple. Aegon, they concluded, was following in the tradition of strong Targaryen kings who understood that royal authority must occasionally be demonstrated through displays of power that transcended conventional morality. His excesses were not weaknesses but calculated demonstrations that the Dragon King was above the petty restrictions that bound ordinary men. By openly flouting the rules that governed everyone else, he was reinforcing the fundamental principle that Targaryens were different, special, chosen by the gods to rule through strength rather than consensus. This interpretation gained credibility from the undeniable fact that Aegon's reign had brought unprecedented prosperity to the realm. The royal treasury, which had been strained by the pious expenditures of Balor the Blessed and the careful but expensive governance of Viserys II, now overflowed with gold. Trade agreements negotiated during the king's progresses brought exotic goods flowing into King's Landing. The great lords, despite their moral qualms, found their own coffers enriched by the complex web of relationships that Aegon had created. Lord Velaryon, whose family had served the Targaryens since before the conquest, became one of the most eloquent proponents of this theory. At court gatherings, he would point out that the realm had known peace throughout Aegon's reign, that no major rebellions had threatened the stability of the crown, that even the perpetually restless Dornish had remained quiet in their southern strongholds. Surely, he argued, these were the marks of effective leadership, whatever one might think of the king's personal conduct. The evidence seemed compelling. The king's progresses, which had initially been viewed as expensive exercises in royal self-indulgence, had actually strengthened the bonds between the Iron Throne and the great houses. Local lords who hosted the royal party found themselves enriched by the experience, their daughters honored with royal attention, their sons offered positions at court or marriages to other noble families. The economic benefits of these visits rippled outward, enriching merchants and craftsmen, creating new markets for local goods. Even the matter of royal bastards could be viewed through this lens of calculated statecraft. Rather than hiding his illegitimate children as sources of shame, Aegon openly acknowledged them, showered them with gifts and honors, and made it clear that they would have roles to play in the governance of the realm. This seemed to demonstrate a kind of refreshing honesty, a rejection of the hypocrisy that had characterized some previous reigns where bastards were quietly supported but never publicly recognized. Queen Nerys, watching these interpretations gain acceptance among the nobility, felt a kind of desperate hope that perhaps she had been wrong about her husband's nature. Maybe his cruelties toward her were the unfortunate but necessary costs of a larger strategy that served the realm's interests. Perhaps her suffering had meaning beyond mere personal tragedy if it was part of a design that brought prosperity and stability to millions of subjects who would never know her name. She began to participate more actively in court functions, forcing herself to smile during celebrations of her husband's bastards. to offer gracious words to his mistresses, to play the role of the understanding wife who recognized that kings must sometimes sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good. The effort nearly broke her, but she persevered, driven by the possibility that her husband's reign might ultimately be judged as successful despite its moral costs. Prince Aemon found this period of rationalization particularly torturous. As a knight sworn to protect the innocent, he could see the individual tragedies that lay behind the broader patterns of prosperity. He knew the names of the serving girls who had been discarded after brief periods of royal favor. He was aware of the noble daughters whose reputations had been destroyed by association with the king. He understood that the stability everyone celebrated was built on a foundation of personal suffering that the official chroniclers would never record. Yet even Aemon could not entirely dismiss the argument that Aegon's methods, however distasteful, were producing results that more conventional approaches to kingship had failed to achieve. The realm was at peace, the treasury was full, and the great houses remained bound to the crown by ties that seemed stronger than mere feudal obligation. Perhaps the price of this success was not too high if it prevented the kind of devastating civil wars that had plagued other kingdoms. The king himself seemed amused by these attempts to find noble purposes behind his actions. At private dinners, he would listen to courtiers explain how his latest scandal was actually a masterstroke of political maneuvering, then smile in ways that suggested he found their rationalizations more entertaining than convincing. When Lord Bracken praised the wisdom of taking multiple mistresses from different regions as a way of strengthening ties with various houses, Aegon's laughter had an edge that made everyone present uncomfortable. But it was Lady Melissa Blackwood who began to voice the doubts that others were afraid to express. Despite her position as the king's favored mistress, or perhaps because of it, she had developed an understanding of Aegon's character that went deeper than the political explanations that satisfied his supporters. In quiet conversations with other court ladies, she began to suggest that they were all missing something essential about the king's nature, that his apparent success might be masking preparations for something far more destructive. Her concerns centered on the way Aegon spoke about his legitimate son and heir. Prince Daeron was growing into a thoughtful, scholarly young man who seemed to embody many of the virtues that his father openly mocked. Rather than taking pride in his heir's developing character, Aegon seemed to view Daeron's goodness as a personal affront, a criticism of his own choices that demanded correction. The king's comments about his son had a quality of resentment that suggested deep psychological currents that had nothing to do with effective statecraft. Melissa's observations gained credibility when she began to document patterns in the king's behavior that suggested his corruption was not random but systematic. He seemed particularly drawn to destroying the reputations of virtuous women, to corrupting the sons of honorable houses, to turning symbols of traditional morality into emblems of compromise and submission. This was not the behavior of a strong king demonstrating his power, but of a deeply damaged man working out personal grievances against the very concept of goodness itself. The realization that Aegon's reign might not be the success story it appeared to be began to spread through the court like a slow poison. Those who had convinced themselves that they were participating in a brilliant if unconventional form of governance started to suspect that they might actually be collaborating in something far more sinister. The prosperity and stability that had seemed to validate the king's methods began to look like symptoms of a deeper disease, temporary benefits that were masking long-term costs that would eventually come due. And in the shadows of the Red Keep, the king's bastards were coming of age. Each one shaped by the peculiar environment their father had created. Each one learning lessons about power and human nature that would have consequences extending far beyond their own lives. The explanation that had seemed to make sense of Aegon's reign was beginning to crumble, revealing beneath it truths that no one was quite ready to confront. The collapse of the comfortable illusions that had sustained the court through the middle years of Aegon's reign began with what historians would later call the War of the Three Sisters, though no actual warfare took place, and the conflict involved only two sisters from House Bracken. The affair marked a turning point in the king's methods, revealing new depths of calculated cruelty that made his earlier scandals seem almost innocent by comparison. Lady Barbara Bracken arrived at court in the 8th year of Aegon's reign, brought to King's Landing by her ambitious father, who had observed the elevation of the Blackwoods through their daughter's relationship with the king, and decided that House Bracken deserved similar opportunities. Barbara was everything that courtly beauty was supposed to embody, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun metal and eyes the color of summer skies. But beneath her physical perfection lay an intelligence and ambition that set her apart from the more passive women who had previously caught the king's attention. Where Lady Melissa Blackwood had been content to serve as the king's companion and confidant, accepting her position with grace, but without seeking to expand her influence, Barbara Bracken had far grander aspirations. She studied the workings of the court with the attention of a master strategist, identifying the sources of real power behind the ceremonial positions, understanding how decisions were actually made and by whom. Within months of her arrival, she had begun to position herself not merely as another royal mistress, but as an unofficial power broker who could influence policy and shape the direction of the realm. The king was fascinated by her ambition in ways that went beyond simple physical attraction. Here was a woman who understood that corruption could be a tool rather than just a weakness, who saw his systematic debasement of traditional morality as an opportunity to create new forms of influence and control. Their relationship became a partnership in manipulation that elevated royal scandal to an art form. But Barbara's rise created a problem that Aegon had not previously faced. Lady Melissa Blackwood, who had served faithfully as his primary mistress for years, found herself displaced by a woman who viewed her not as a sister in shared humiliation, but as a rival to be eliminated. The ancient feuds between House Blackwood and House Bracken, which had simmered for generations over disputed lands and old grievances, suddenly erupted into the corridors of the Red Keep with a viciousness that shocked even experienced courtiers. The king, rather than seeking to mediate between his two mistresses, chose instead to encourage their rivalry. He began to play them against each other with the skill of a master puppeteer, offering favors to one that were designed to infuriate the other, creating situations where they were forced to compete for his attention in increasingly degrading ways. What might have been a private matter between three individuals became a public spectacle that drew in their families, their supporters, and ultimately much of the nobility. The Blackwood and Bracken factions that emerged from this rivalry extended far beyond questions of royal favor. They became competing visions of how the realm should be governed, what relationships between the crown and the great houses should look like, and what role traditional morality should play in political decision-making. The Blackwood faction, led by Melissa's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation, represented those who believed that some standards should be maintained even in an age of corruption. The Bracken faction, energized by Barbara's ruthless ambition, argued that the old ways were dead and that survival required embracing new forms of power based on pragmatism rather than principle. Queen Nyris found herself trapped between these competing factions, unable to support either without compromising what remained of her own moral authority. Her attempts to remain above the fray were interpreted by both sides as weakness, and her obvious distress at the escalating scandal was seen as evidence that she lacked the strength necessary to be an effective queen in Aegon's transformed court. The woman who should have been the moral center of the realm had been reduced to a passive observer of her own degradation. Prince Aemon watched the unfolding crisis with growing alarm. As Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, he was sworn to protect all members of the royal family, but the king's behavior was creating situations where that protection was meaningless. How could he guard the queen's honor when the king himself was systematically destroying it? How could he maintain order in a court where the primary source of chaos was the man he was sworn to obey? The Dragon Knight began to spend more time away from the Red Keep, leading patrols in the Kingswood, inspecting defenses along the coast, finding any excuse to escape the poisonous atmosphere that his brother had created. But even when he was physically absent, he could not escape the knowledge of what was happening in his absence. Reports reached him of new humiliations inflicted on the Queen, fresh scandals involving the rival mistresses, and the king's obvious delight in the suffering he was causing to everyone around him. During one of their rare private conversations, Nerys confessed to Aemon that she had begun to question whether her marriage vows still held any meaning. If the king had abandoned all pretense of honoring his obligations as a husband, did she have any moral duty to continue honoring hers as a wife? The question hung between them like a sword, representing possibilities that neither dared to fully explore, but both found impossible to ignore. Their relationship had evolved into something that existed in the spaces between words, in glances that lasted a moment too long, in touches that seemed accidental but felt deliberate. They never spoke directly of their feelings for each other, but their mutual devotion had become so obvious that even the servants whispered about it in the corridors. Yet their very restraint, their refusal to cross the lines that their honor still recognized, seemed to make their connection more powerful rather than less. The king observed this growing intimacy between his wife and brother, with the same detached amusement that he brought to all the human dramas playing out around him. He began to create situations designed to test their resolve, sending Aemon on missions that required him to escort the queen, arranging private dinners where they would be forced to sit together while he entertained his current mistress, making comments that acknowledged their feelings while simultaneously making it clear that he considered their restraint a form of entertainment rather than virtue. This psychological torture revealed new aspects of Aegon's character that disturbed even his most cynical supporters. It was one thing to use corruption as a tool of statecraft, to exploit human weaknesses for political advantage. It was quite another to systematically destroy the people closest to him for no purpose beyond his own amusement. The king was not merely immoral, he was actively evil in ways that served no larger purpose than the satisfaction of his own twisted psychology. The realization that they were serving a monster rather than merely a corrupt king began to penetrate the consciousness of the court. Lords who had convinced themselves that they were participating in a necessary political evolution started to understand that they were actually enabling the systematic destruction of everything that had made their civilization worth preserving. The prosperity and stability that had seemed to justify Aegon's methods began to look like symptoms of a deeper rot that was eating away at the foundations of the realm. In the Godswood of the Red Keep, where the ancient weirwood still stood as a reminder of older truths and simpler moralities, Queen Nerys and Prince Aemon would walk together in silence, both understanding that their world was ending around them, but neither knowing how to stop the dissolution. The leaves whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech, carrying warnings that neither the queen nor the knight could fully understand, but both instinctively feared. The bastards were growing stronger and more confident, shaped by their father's example into creatures who understood power but not responsibility, who had learned to take what they wanted without consideration for the consequences. And somewhere in the shadows of the future, the seeds of civil war were already beginning to germinate, fed by the hatreds and resentments that Aegon's reign had so carefully cultivated. The 9th year of Aegon's reign brought revelations that shattered whatever remained of the comfortable assumptions that had allowed the nobility to rationalize their complicity in his corruption. What had begun as scandals involving individual families had evolved into a systematic restructuring of the entire social order, with implications that reached far beyond the Red Keep and into the fundamental relationships that held the Seven Kingdoms together. The catalyst for these discoveries was the arrival of Serene of Lyssa, a woman whose beauty was so extraordinary that her very presence seemed to silence conversations and stop the normal flow of court life. Unlike the previous royal mistresses, who had at least been Westerosi noblewomen with familiar cultural backgrounds, Serene represented something entirely foreign to the traditional order. She was a courtesan trained in the pleasure houses of the free cities, a professional whose skills went far beyond anything that even the most worldly members of the court had previously encountered. But Serene brought more than exotic beauty to King's Landing. She arrived with knowledge of financial practices and trade relationships that revealed the true scope of Aegon's transformation of royal governance. Through her connections with Lysene banking houses and Tyroshi trading companies, the king had been quietly restructuring the realm's economy in ways that made him virtually independent of traditional sources of royal revenue. No longer did he need to depend on taxes levied through the great houses or loans negotiated through Westerosi merchants. Instead, he had created alternative financial networks that bypassed the established nobility entirely. This economic independence explained much about his political behavior that had previously seemed merely self-indulgent. The king could afford to ignore the concerns of traditional allies because he no longer needed their support to maintain royal power. His corruption of individual families was not weakness but strength, creating new forms of obligation that supplemented rather than replaced older systems of feudal loyalty. Every scandal, every affair, every bastard born in the shadows of the Red Keep was part of a larger design that was reshaping the fundamental nature of royal authority. Lord Butterwell, whose quiet investigations had first revealed the calculated nature of Aegon's apparent chaos, began to understand that he had uncovered only the surface of a transformation that went to the very heart of how kingdoms functioned. The traditional relationship between crown and nobility, based on mutual obligation and shared cultural values, was being replaced by something more purely transactional. Loyalty was becoming a commodity to be bought and sold, honor a luxury that only those outside the system could afford to maintain. The implications were staggering. If Aegon's methods proved successful, they would fundamentally alter the nature of noble society throughout Westeros. Future kings would no longer need to court the approval of great houses or maintain the complex balances that had traditionally prevented any one faction from becoming too powerful. Instead, they could rule through networks of personal dependency and financial obligation that made traditional forms of resistance obsolete. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that Aegon's bastards were not accidents or embarrassments to be hidden, but essential components of this new system. Each illegitimate child represented a potential ally who owed everything to royal favor and nothing to traditional inheritance. They were being raised to serve as administrators, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives who would be loyal to the crown rather than to any particular region or house. In effect, Aegon was creating a parallel nobility that could eventually replace the established order entirely. Daemon Waters, the king's eldest bastard, had already begun to demonstrate the potential of this new breed of royal servant. Legitimately brilliant and charismatically confident, he moved through the court with an easy familiarity that made established nobles uncomfortable. He understood both the old systems that his father was destroying and the new ones that were taking their place, making him uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between the traditional order and whatever was coming next. The other bastards, though younger, showed similar promise. They were being educated not just in the traditional arts of warfare and statecraft, but in the more subtle skills of manipulation and control that their father had perfected. They learned languages spoken in the free cities, studied financial practices that most Westerosi nobles considered beneath their dignity, and developed relationships with merchants and craftsmen that aristocratic children would normally never encounter. Queen Nerys watched this systematic preparation of her husband's illegitimate children with a growing sense of horror. She began to understand that Prince Daeron, her own son and the legitimate heir to the throne, was being positioned not as the future king, but as a symbol of everything that Aegon intended to destroy. Daeron's virtues, his scholarly nature and moral seriousness, were being used by his father as contrast to highlight the superiority of the new order that the bastards represented. The psychological pressure on the legitimate prince was becoming unbearable. Daeron found himself constantly compared unfavorably to his illegitimate half-brothers, criticized for showing interest in history and philosophy rather than the more practical arts of corruption and manipulation. His attempts to maintain the moral standards that his mother had taught him were treated as evidence of weakness, while his half-brother's enthusiastic embrace of their father's methods was praised as strength and realism. Prince Aemon recognized in Daeron's struggles an echo of his own moral conflicts, but with stakes that were infinitely higher. Where Aemon could retreat into the relative simplicity of his knightly vows, Daeron would someday be expected to rule a realm that his father was systematically transforming into something unrecognizable. The young prince was being forced to choose between preserving his own integrity and preparing himself to be an effective king, between honoring his mother's teachings and learning the lessons that his father insisted were necessary for survival. The court began to divide into factions that had little to do with traditional political allegiances and everything to do with fundamental questions about the nature of power and morality. Those who supported Aegon's transformation argued that he was creating a more efficient and stable form of government, one less dependent on the arbitrary loyalties of an increasingly obsolete nobility. Those who opposed it insisted that some things were more important than efficiency, that a realm without honor and virtue was not worth governing regardless of how stable it might be. But these philosophical debates were taking place against a backdrop of increasingly personal cruelty that suggested the king's motives went beyond political calculation. His treatment of Queen Nerys had evolved into a kind of systematic torture that served no purpose beyond his own entertainment. He would force her to attend celebrations of his bastards' birthdays, to smile while his mistresses wore jewelry that should have been hers, to participate in religious ceremonies that had been deliberately corrupted to mock her faith. The queen's suffering had become so visible that it was beginning to affect the morale of the entire court. Even those who supported the king's political methods found it difficult to watch the destruction of a woman whose only crime was believing in the sanctity of marriage vows. Her obvious pain served as a constant reminder of the human costs of Aegon's reign, costs that could not be justified by any amount of political success. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the Red Keep lay sleeping and the corridors echoed with the ghosts of better times, Prince Aemon would sometimes find Queen Nerys kneeling in the royal sept, her prayers barely audible whispers that seemed to carry all the weight of a kingdom's lost innocence. He would stand in the shadows, watching over her as his vows demanded, understanding that they were both trapped in a tragedy that was larger than their personal feelings, victims of a king whose appetites had grown too large for any kingdom to contain. The realm held its breath, sensing that something fundamental was ending, that the world they had known was disappearing beneath the weight of one man's unlimited hunger for power and pleasure. And in the distance, like thunder before a storm, the future was already beginning to announce itself through the laughter of bastards who would someday claim the right to rule. The truth that would reshape everyone's understanding of Aegon's reign emerged not through dramatic confrontation or political crisis, but through the quiet observations of a dying man. Grand Maester Munkun, who had served the Iron Throne faithfully for decades and witnessed the reigns of 4 different kings, lay on his deathbed in the 10th year of Aegon's rule, his mind still sharp despite his body's failure. In those final days, as he prepared his private journals for destruction, he made a discovery that chilled him more than the prospect of his own approaching death. Hidden within seemingly routine correspondence between various maesters throughout the realm, Munkun found evidence of a pattern so vast and so carefully orchestrated that its very scope had rendered it invisible to casual observation. For years he had assumed that the reports reaching him from other castles represented isolated incidents of moral decay, spreading outward from King's Landing like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Instead, he now realized he had been witnessing the systematic execution of a plan that had been developing for the entire length of Aegon's reign. The evidence was scattered across hundreds of seemingly unconnected documents. A report from Oldtown, mentioning the unusual number of noble daughters being sent to serve at various courts, correspondence from the Reach describing new trade relationships that bypassed traditional mercantile families, letters from the north discussing the arrival of southern knights seeking service with local lords. Individually, these reports meant nothing. Collectively, they revealed a web of influence and obligation that extended throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon had not merely been corrupting the nobility of King's Landing. He had been systematically placing his creatures throughout the realm, using his progresses and the marriages of his bastards to create networks of loyalty that had nothing to do with traditional feudal relationships. Every great house now harbored individuals whose primary allegiance was to the Iron Throne rather than to their nominal lords. Every major castle included servants, knights, or minor nobles whose positions had been arranged through royal influence and who reported back to the king through channels that circumvented established hierarchies. But the most disturbing revelation concerned the children. For years, observers had noted that certain noble families seemed unusually blessed with offspring who bore the distinctive Targaryen features of silver hair and purple eyes. These children had been dismissed as evidence of ancient bloodlines reasserting themselves, distant cousins whose ancestry traced back to the early days of Targaryen rule. Monkton's research suggested a far more troubling explanation. The king's progresses throughout the realm had left behind a trail of royal bastards that extended far beyond the acknowledged children who lived at court. In castles from Winterfell to Sunspear, children were growing to maturity who carried the dragon's blood but had no knowledge of their true parentage. Their mothers had been sworn to secrecy, their fathers convinced that discretion was essential for the children's safety. But these scattered bastards were not abandoned accidents of royal lust. They were strategic placements, future assets who could be activated when the time was right. The implications were staggering. When these hidden bastards came of age, they would represent a reserve army of potential claimants who could challenge any legitimate heir who proved troublesome to royal interests. More immediately, they provided the king with intelligence networks and sources of influence in every corner of the realm. A bastard raised in the household of a great lord would have access to information and opportunities that even the most skilled spy could never achieve. Queen Naerys received this information from Grand Maester Monkton just hours before his death, delivered in a private conversation that left her feeling as though the very foundations of reality had shifted beneath her feet. She finally understood why her husband had seemed so confident despite engaging in behavior that should have destroyed any king. He was not risking his throne through his excesses. He was using those apparent excesses to create an entirely new form of royal power that would make traditional forms of opposition meaningless. The knowledge was almost too vast to absorb. Every scandal, every affair, every public humiliation that she had endured had been part of a larger design that transformed personal degradation into political advantage. Her suffering had not been meaningless cruelty but calculated strategy, designed to demonstrate that even the queen herself was subject to the king's unlimited will. If Aegon could publicly humiliate his own wife without consequence, what lord would dare to challenge him over lesser matters? Prince Aemon learned of Monkton's discoveries through the Queen, and the revelation completed his transformation from loyal brother to potential rebel. For years, he had struggled with the conflict between his personal honor and his duty to the crown, telling himself that his primary obligation was to preserve stability regardless of his personal feelings about the king's behavior. Now he understood that the stability he had been protecting was itself an illusion, a temporary calm that masked preparations for a form of tyranny that would make previous examples of royal abuse seem gentle by comparison. The Dragon Knight began to see his brother's reign through entirely new eyes. Every act of apparent weakness or self-indulgence revealed itself as calculated manipulation. The king's obesity and public drunkenness were not signs of a man losing control but disguises that encouraged his enemies to underestimate him. His open debauchery was not evidence of moral collapse but demonstration that he was powerful enough to violate every social convention without consequence. His treatment of the Queen was not personal cruelty but political theater designed to show that nothing was sacred enough to protect from royal will. But perhaps most troubling of all was the realization that Prince Daeron, the legitimate heir, was not merely being compared unfavorably to his bastard half-brothers. He was being systematically undermined and discredited in preparation for his eventual replacement. The king's apparent frustration with his heir's moral scruples was not paternal disappointment, but deliberate sabotage. Daeron was being set up to fail, his very virtues transformed into evidence of his unfitness to rule in the new order that his father was creating. The bastards themselves, particularly Daemon Waters, began to look like something more sinister than merely favored illegitimate children. They were being prepared to serve as the enforcers and administrators of a system that would reduce the traditional nobility to irrelevance. Their education in languages and financial practices, their relationships with foreign merchants and craftsmen, their obvious comfort with the corruption that surrounded them, all of these qualities that had seemed like evidence of their adaptability now appeared as training for roles that would require them to dismantle everything that previous generations had built. Lady Barbara Bracken, whose ambition had initially seemed like personal opportunism, revealed herself as something approaching a co-conspirator in the king's larger design. Her rivalry with Lady Melissa Blackwood had not been mere jealousy but strategic positioning. By encouraging the ancient feud between their houses, she had helped to demonstrate that even the oldest and most prideful families could be manipulated into serving royal purposes. Her rise to influence had not been about personal advancement, but about proving that the traditional nobility could be replaced by individuals whose only qualification was their willingness to serve the king's interests. The court began to understand that they had been participating not in a particularly corrupt traditional monarchy, but in something entirely new and potentially far more dangerous. The economic prosperity and political stability that had seemed to justify Aegon's excesses now appeared as symptoms of a system that was consuming the very foundations of the society it pretended to serve. The king was not merely ruling badly, he was deliberately destroying one form of governance in order to replace it with another that would concentrate power in ways that previous tyrants had never imagined possible. In the Godswood, where the ancient weirwood had stood for centuries as a symbol of continuity and natural order, Queen Naerys and Prince Aemon walked together through the autumn twilight, both of them understanding that they were witnessing the end of their world. The leaves that fell around them seemed to whisper warnings in languages that predated human ambition, carrying messages about the cycles of growth and decay that governed all kingdoms. But the forces that Aegon had unleashed appeared to operate outside those natural patterns, representing something that was not merely corrupt but actively hostile to the very concept of natural order. The revelation changed everything, while changing nothing. The knowledge of what was really happening brought no power to stop it, no ability to warn those who might still be saved. The web of complicity and dependency that the king had created was too vast and too carefully constructed to be easily dismantled. Those who might have the courage to resist lacked the power to be effective, while those who possessed power had too much to lose from opposition. And somewhere in the shadows of the Red Keep, King Aegon continued his patient work of transformation, surrounded by bastards and mistresses and corrupted nobles, all of them playing their assigned roles in a drama whose final act would reshape the very nature of royal authority throughout the known world. The final pieces of Aegon's grand design became visible in the 11th year of his reign, revealed not through investigation or deduction, but through the king's own growing confidence that his transformation of the realm had progressed beyond the point where opposition could be effective. What had once been carefully hidden now began to emerge into the open, as if Aegon had decided that the time for secrecy had passed and the moment for demonstration had arrived. The revelation began with the ceremony that would later be known as the presentation of swords, though no songs would ever celebrate what transpired that day. In the great throne room of the Red Keep, before an assembly that included representatives from every great house in the Seven Kingdoms, King Aegon formally acknowledged not just his bastards at court, but dozens of illegitimate children who had been summoned from castles throughout the realm. One by one, they knelt before the Iron Throne to receive gifts that were clearly not random acts of royal generosity, but carefully planned distributions of power. The most significant of these presentations involved Daemon Waters, the king's eldest bastard, who received the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire that had been carried by Aegon the Conqueror himself. The weapon was not merely a gift, but a symbol, a statement that legitimacy could be transferred through royal will rather than birth. In giving Daemon the sword that represented the very foundation of Targaryen power, Aegon was announcing that he considered his bastard son to be his true heir, regardless of the legal claims of Prince Daeron. But the ceremony revealed far more than just the king's preference for one son over another. Each bastard who received recognition that day represented a different region of the realm, a different great house that had been penetrated by royal influence. Aegon Waters, called Bittersteel, whose mother was Barbara Bracken, received lands in the Riverlands that would make him a power in that region. Brynden Waters, born of Melissa Blackwood, was granted authority over networks of spies and informants that extended throughout the realm. Other bastards received positions that would give them influence in the Vale, the Reach, Dawn, and even the distant north. The assembled lords watched in growing horror as they began to understand the true scope of what Aegon had accomplished. He had not merely fathered illegitimate children, he had systematically seeded the entire realm with potential allies who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. Every great house now harbored individuals whose primary loyalty was to the Iron Throne rather than to traditional feudal relationships. The bastards were not embarrassments to be hidden, but the foundation of a new form of governance that could bypass the established nobility entirely. Lord Stark of Winterfell, whose family had served the Targaryen dynasty faithfully since the conquest, found himself looking at a bastard son who bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the king and held a position of influence in his own household that had been arranged years earlier through what had seemed like routine court appointments. Lord Tyrell of Highgarden realized that his most trusted advisor was a man whose ultimate allegiance was not to the Reach, but to a king who had systematically corrupted the very concept of feudal loyalty. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that Prince Daeron himself had been isolated and undermined far more thoroughly than even his closest supporters had realized. The young prince, now approaching his majority, discovered that many of the men he had considered friends and mentors were actually agents of his father's alternative power structure. His education, his relationships, even his understanding of his own position had been shaped by individuals whose primary goal was to ensure that he would be unprepared to rule effectively when his time came. Queen Nerys watched the ceremony with the frozen composure that had become her signature response to public humiliation, but those who knew her well could see the depth of her anguish. This was not merely another scandal or affair, but the formal announcement that her son's birthright had been transferred to his illegitimate half-brothers, the marriage that had been the foundation of her identity, the sacred vows that she had honored despite years of abuse, had been rendered meaningless by a husband who viewed legitimacy itself as an obsolete concept. Prince Aemon stood behind the Iron Throne in his white cloak, his hand resting on his sword hilt, watching his brother systematically destroy everything that their family had spent generations building. The ceremony was not just about redistributing power, but about demonstrating that power itself could be redefined according to the whims of whoever possessed the strongest will. Traditional concepts like honor, legitimacy, and feudal obligation were being revealed as mere conventions that could be discarded whenever they became inconvenient. The international implications of Aegon's transformation were becoming equally clear. Representatives from the free cities who attended the ceremony were not mere guests but partners in a new form of governance that looked eastward toward Essos rather than inward toward traditional Westerosi relationships. The king had been building alliances with Tyrosh, Lys, and Myr that would provide alternative sources of military support and financial backing, reducing his dependence on the loyalty of his own great houses. This Eastern orientation explained much about the recent changes in court culture. The arrival of Cyrene of Lys had not been an isolated incident but part of a larger process of cultural transformation. Eastern practices of governance, Eastern concepts of royal authority, Eastern forms of economic organization were gradually replacing the feudal traditions that had governed Westeros since the conquest. The Seven Kingdoms were being systematically reshaped into something that resembled the despotisms of Essos more than the traditional monarchy that the nobility expected. The bastards themselves had clearly been prepared for this moment throughout their entire lives. They moved through the ceremony with the confidence of individuals who understood their roles in a larger design. Daemon Waters accepted Blackfyre not as a gift but as a responsibility he had long expected to receive. Bittersteel took his lands in the Riverlands as a general might accept a command in enemy territory. Bloodraven received his authority over intelligence networks as a spider might claim a web that had been years in the construction. But it was the reaction of the legitimate heir that provided the most telling insight into the true nature of what was happening. Prince Daeron stood among the observers rather than participating in the ceremony, effectively reduced to the status of a witness to his own disinheritance. His face showed none of the rage or desperation that might have been expected from a young man watching his birthright being transferred to illegitimate rivals. Instead, there was a kind of weary resignation that suggested he had long understood what his father intended but had been powerless to prevent it. The prince's acceptance of his fate revealed another aspect of Aegon's psychological manipulation. Daeron had not simply been undermined and isolated. He had been systematically convinced that he was unworthy of the throne that should have been his by right. Years of comparison with his more aggressive and pragmatic half-brothers had left him believing that his moral scruples were weaknesses rather than virtues, that his scholarly interests were evidence of unfitness for rule rather than preparation for wise governance. In the days following the ceremony, the full implications of what the assembled lords had witnessed began to penetrate throughout the realm. Ravens flew to every castle, carrying news that would reshape the political calculations of every great house. The traditional balance of power that had maintained stability since the conquest had been fundamentally altered. The great houses could no longer count on their ancestral relationships with the Iron Throne to protect their interests. Instead, they would have to navigate a new system based on personal relationships with royal bastards whose loyalties lay elsewhere. Some houses attempted to adapt to the new reality by offering their own daughters to the bastards, hoping to create marriage alliances that would provide some influence in the emerging power structure. Others began to withdraw from court entirely, retreating to their ancestral lands and hoping to avoid entanglement in what they correctly perceived as a fundamental transformation of the nature of royal authority. But withdrawal was not truly an option. The networks of influence and obligation that Aegon had created were too extensive and too deeply rooted to be simply ignored. Every great house discovered that they harbored individuals whose ultimate loyalties lay with the crown rather than with their nominal lords. The transformation that had seemed like a distant concern affecting only the court in King's Landing was revealed as a process that had already reshaped the entire realm. The age of traditional feudalism was ending, replaced by something newer and potentially far more dangerous. The bastards stood ready to inherit not just their father's throne, but his vision of unlimited royal authority, unconstrained by the traditions and customs that had previously provided some protection for the rights of subjects. The realm held its breath, sensing that the changes that had already occurred were merely preparation for transformations that would dwarf anything that had come before. In the shadow of the great revelation that had reshaped everyone's understanding of the realm's future, an informal council began to form among those who still remembered what the Seven Kingdoms had been before Aegon's transformation. They gathered not in the great halls where official business was conducted, but in quiet corners of the Red Keep and in private chambers where conversations could remain unheard by the networks of spies and informants that now permeated every level of society. Grand Maester Orwyle, who had succeeded the deceased Ma, became the reluctant keeper of institutional memory, the man who preserved records and traditions that the new order seemed determined to eliminate. In his private study, surrounded by chronicles that detailed centuries of Targaryen rule, he began to document the changes that were transforming the very nature of monarchy. His writings, hidden in code among routine administrative documents, preserved knowledge that he feared might otherwise be lost forever. The Maester's research revealed patterns that extended far beyond Aegon's personal reign. The transformation of royal authority that seemed so revolutionary was actually the culmination of tendencies that had been present in Targaryen rule from the very beginning. The Dragon Kings had always been different from traditional feudal monarchs. Their power derived from sources that transcended normal political relationships. What Aegon had accomplished was to strip away the conventions and compromises that had previously concealed the true nature of Targaryen authority. Lord Commander Aemon found himself in the impossible position of serving as both the keeper of knightly ideals and the witness to their systematic destruction. His conversations with the few remaining knights who still took their vows seriously had taken on the character of funeral rites, elegiac discussions of virtues that seemed to have no place in the world that was emerging. Yet even as they mourned the death of chivalry, these men began to recognize their responsibility to preserve whatever wisdom they could for whatever future might come after Aegon's reign ended. The Dragon Knight's private discussions with Queen Naris had evolved into something resembling a conspiracy of memory, an attempt to maintain some connection to the values and traditions that her husband was systematically eradicating. They spoke of the early days of Targaryen rule, when the dragons had been symbols of justice rather than instruments of intimidation. They recalled the reigns of kings who had used their power to protect the innocent rather than to corrupt them, who had seen themselves as servants of the realm rather than its masters. But these conversations were haunted by the knowledge that neither of them possessed the power to restore what was being lost. Aemon's position as Lord Commander gave him influence but not authority, respect but not the ability to command obedience from those who had already chosen to serve the new order. Naris's status as queen provided her with ceremonial importance but no real political power, particularly since her husband had made it clear that her opinions were less valuable than those of his mistresses and bastards. Prince Daeron, who should have been the natural focus for those who opposed his father's transformation of the realm, had been so thoroughly undermined that he seemed almost relieved to be excluded from power rather than burdened with the responsibility of wielding it. His education, shaped by tutors who served his father's agenda rather than his own interests, had left him believing that the traditional forms of kingship were obsolete, that the future belonged to those who could adapt to the new realities that Aegon was creating. The prince's acceptance of his marginalization represented perhaps the greatest triumph of his father's psychological manipulation. By convincing Daeron that his moral scruples were weaknesses rather than strengths, Aegon had eliminated potential opposition from the one person who might have had both the legitimacy and the motivation to challenge the emerging system. The legitimate heir had been transformed into a willing participant in his own disinheritance, a living demonstration that traditional concepts of rightful succession could be rendered meaningless through skillful manipulation. Yet even as the official structures of resistance crumbled, other forms of opposition began to emerge from unexpected quarters. Servants and minor functionaries who had been displaced by the king's transformation began to share information about the scope of the changes that were taking place. Kitchen maids who had been dismissed for refusing royal advances compared their experiences with those of seamstresses and laundresses who had faced similar choices. Guards who had been reassigned after expressing disapproval of court policies discussed their observations with stable hands and blacksmiths who had witnessed the arrival of foreign advisors and Eastern practices. These informal networks of communication began to reveal details about the king's plans that even his closest advisors might not have fully understood. The scope of the surveillance systems that had been established, the extent of the financial relationships with foreign powers, the true number of bastards who had been placed in positions throughout the realm. All of this information began to circulate among those who had the most to lose from the new order, but the least power to oppose it directly. Lady Melissa Blackwood, whose fall from favor had provided her with a unique perspective on the king's methods, became an unexpected source of insight into the psychological mechanisms that Aegon used to control those around him. Her conversations with other discarded mistresses and dismissed courtiers revealed patterns of manipulation that went far beyond simple seduction or political corruption. The king seemed to take particular pleasure in identifying the specific weaknesses and vulnerabilities of each individual he sought to control, then exploiting those weaknesses with a precision that suggested years of careful observation and planning. Her revelations about the king's methods helped others understand how they had been manipulated into complicity with systems they would never have consciously chosen to support. The process had been so gradual and so carefully orchestrated that each compromise had seemed reasonable in isolation. Each small surrender of principle had been justified by circumstances that appeared unique and temporary. Only when viewed from a distance did the cumulative effect become clear, revealing how thoroughly the entire court had been reshaped according to Aegon's vision. But perhaps the most disturbing insight came from those who had observed the bastards most closely during their formative years. Servants who had cared for them, tutors who had educated them, guards who had protected them, all reported that these children had been raised with a systematic contempt for the traditional values that most noble children absorbed naturally. They had been taught that loyalty was a commodity, that honor was a weakness, that power was the only virtue that mattered in practical affairs. This educational philosophy had produced individuals who were uniquely suited to serve as administrators of the new order, but completely unsuited to preserve anything valuable from the old one. The bastards were not merely corrupt nobles, but something entirely different, representatives of a form of authority that recognized no limitations beyond the reach of its own power. They had been shaped by their father's vision into perfect instruments of transformation, capable of completing the destruction that he had begun. The gathering of this scattered wisdom created its own dangers for those brave enough to participate in the process. The king's surveillance networks were extensive and sophisticated, capable of detecting patterns of communication that might indicate organized opposition. Several individuals who had been too open in their criticism simply disappeared, reassigned to distant postings, or removed from their positions for unspecified failures in their duties. The message was clear, without being explicitly stated. Knowledge was acceptable as long as it remained private, but sharing that knowledge with others would not be tolerated. In the Godswood, where the ancient weirwood stood, as a reminder of powers older than dragons, small groups would sometimes gather in the pre-dawn darkness to share what they had learned and to plan for whatever future might emerge from the ruins of what they had lost. These meetings had the character of religious services, rituals of remembrance that preserved traditions and values that seemed to have no place in the world that was emerging around them. They spoke in whispers of the possibility that Aegon's reign might someday end, that the transformation he had accomplished might prove temporary rather than permanent. But they also acknowledged the more likely possibility that the changes were irreversible, that the Seven Kingdoms would never again resemble the realm they had once known. In either case, they understood their responsibility to preserve whatever wisdom they could for those who would inherit whatever came next. The final years of Aegon's reign unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a fever breaking, as the king's body began to betray the appetites that had defined his rule, while his mind grew ever sharper in its malice. By his 12th year on the throne, the man who had once been physically imposing had become grotesquely obese, his bloated form requiring assistance to mount the steps to the iron throne that had once symbolized his power. Yet this physical deterioration seemed only to concentrate his psychological cruelty, as if the failing flesh had distilled his essence into something purely venomous. The court watched this transformation with fascination and horror, understanding that they were witnessing the final act of a reign that had already reshaped everything they thought they knew about royal authority. Aegon's increasing infirmity created a strange atmosphere of anticipation, as if the entire realm was holding its breath waiting for a storm that everyone could sense approaching, but no one could predict with certainty. Queen Nerys had aged decades in the years since she had learned the true scope of her husband's design. The ethereal beauty that had once made her seem like something from the songs had faded into a translucent fragility that made courtiers uncomfortable to observe. She moved through the Red Keep like a ghost haunting scenes of past happiness, her presence a constant reminder of the innocence that had been sacrificed to create the new order. Yet beneath her apparent frailty lay a core of steel that had been tempered by years of suffering into something unbreakable. Her relationship with Prince Aemon had evolved into something beyond the categories that court gossip usually employed to describe such connections. They were not lovers in any physical sense, for their honor had never permitted them to cross that final boundary. Neither were they merely friends, for the intensity of their mutual devotion transcended ordinary friendship. Instead, they had become something like co-conspirators in the preservation of values that their world seemed determined to destroy, united by shared suffering and common purpose in ways that made their bond stronger than many marriages. Prince Daeron had reached his majority, bearing the visible scars of his father's psychological warfare. The young man who should have been preparing to inherit the greatest throne in the known world had instead learned to expect nothing and hoped for less. His education in humiliation had been thorough and systematic, designed not merely to undermine his confidence, but to convince him that his father's assessment of his unfitness was accurate. The legitimate heir had been transformed into his own harshest critic, a man who would someday inherit power while believing himself unworthy to wield it. The bastards, by contrast, had grown into their roles with the confidence of individuals who had always known their destiny. Daemon Waters moved through the court with the easy authority of a king in waiting, his possession of Blackfyre serving as a constant reminder that legitimacy was a question of power rather than birth. Adela Rivers had established himself as a military commander of genuine ability, leading royal forces with a ruthlessness that made veteran soldiers respect his competence even as they questioned his methods. Brynden Rivers had developed the intelligence networks that his father had created into instruments of surveillance and control that would have made Eastern despots envious. But it was the king's treatment of his legitimate son during this period that revealed the true depths of his cruelty. Rather than simply ignoring Daeron or excluding him from important decisions, Aegon began to actively humiliate the prince in public, creating situations designed to demonstrate his unfitness for rule. Court gatherings became exercises in psychological torture, with the king asking his legitimate heir questions about statecraft and military strategy that had been deliberately designed to expose his lack of practical experience, then praising his bastard sons for providing the answers that Daeron had been systematically prevented from learning. These public humiliations served multiple purposes beyond mere personal cruelty. They prepared the court for the eventual transition of power from the legitimate line to the bastard branches, creating a narrative that would make that transition seem natural rather than revolutionary. They also provided the bastards with opportunities to demonstrate their superior fitness for rule, building their reputations at their legitimate brothers' expense. Most importantly, they established the principle that royal succession should be based on capability rather than birth order, a concept that would have profound implications for the stability of future reigns. The great lords who observed these performances understood that they were witnessing more than family dysfunction. The systematic destruction of Prince Darren's reputation was preparation for changes that would affect the entire realm. If the king could disinherit his legitimate son in favor of bastards, then the traditional relationships between the Iron Throne and the great houses were meaningless. Every alliance, every marriage contract, every assumption about the future had to be reconsidered in light of the new realities that Aegon was creating. Some houses attempted to position themselves for the coming transition by strengthening their relationships with the ascendant bastards. Others tried to maintain neutrality, hoping to avoid entanglement in what they correctly perceived as a fundamental transformation of the political order. A few, led by families whose honor meant more to them than their survival, began to discuss the possibility that some changes were too dangerous to be permitted, regardless of the personal costs of opposition. But these discussions remained necessarily private and carefully circumscribed. The intelligence networks that Brynden Rivers had constructed made open opposition not just dangerous but impossible. Every conversation was potentially monitored. Every letter subject to interception, every gathering watched for signs of seditious planning. The realm had become a place where thoughts themselves could be treasonous, where the very concept of legitimate dissent had been rendered obsolete. Queen Naerys found herself in the peculiar position of being both the most visible victim of the king's cruelty and the only person who still retained enough moral authority to speak against it. Her obvious suffering had made her a symbol of everything that was being destroyed, but her royal status provided her with a platform that others lacked. She began to use her ceremonial duties to send subtle messages of resistance, choosing her words carefully during public prayers, selecting charitable causes that implicitly criticized royal policies, appearing at court functions with a dignity that served as implicit rebuke to the degradation that surrounded her. Her acts of quiet defiance did not go unnoticed by her husband, who seemed to find them more amusing than threatening. Aegon had always understood that his wife's virtue was more valuable to him as a contrast to his own corruption than it would have been if he had succeeded in destroying it completely. Her resistance provided him with entertainment and gave his supporters something to dismiss as irrelevant idealism. More importantly, it allowed him to demonstrate that even the most principled opposition was powerless to effect real change in the system he had created. Prince Aemon watched his beloved struggles with growing desperation, understanding that his own position prevented him from offering the protection that his heart demanded. His white cloak had become both shield and chain, protecting him from some consequences of his feelings while binding him to serve the very man who was destroying everything he held dear. The oaths that had once been sources of pride and purpose had become instruments of torture, forcing him to stand witness to atrocities that his honor demanded he prevent, but his duty required him to permit. As the king's health continued to decline and his malice continued to intensify, those who still possessed conscience began to understand that they were approaching a moment of final choice. The system that Aegon had created would not simply end with his death, but would continue under the guidance of successors who had been shaped by his vision and trained in his methods. The transformation that had seemed gradual and possibly reversible was revealing itself as permanent and comprehensive, a fundamental alteration in the nature of royal authority that would outlive its architect. The end came not with the dramatic flourish that songs would later invent, but with the calculated precision that had characterized every aspect of Aegon's reign. In the early months of 184 AC, as winter began to tighten its grip on King's Landing, and the king's health failed with each passing day, those closest to the throne understood that they were witnessing not merely the death of a monarch, but the completion of a transformation that would reshape the Seven Kingdoms forever. Aegon's final illness was as much performance as genuine medical crisis. The king, confined to his chambers but still possessed of the sharp intelligence that had made him so dangerous, used his approaching death as an opportunity to orchestrate one last demonstration of his power over human nature. He summoned representatives from every great house to attend his deathbed, ostensibly to receive their final oaths of loyalty, but actually to force them to witness the ultimate expression of his contempt for everything their world had once held sacred. The scene that unfolded in the royal chambers during those final days revealed the true genius of Aegon's long campaign against traditional authority. Every person present had been compromised in some way by their association with his reign, their hands dirtied by complicity in systems they would never have consciously chosen to support. The great lords who attended him were not there as representatives of ancient and honorable houses, but as men who had learned to value survival over principle, advancement over integrity. They had been transformed by their service to him into creatures capable of accepting whatever final insult he chose to inflict upon the realm. Queen Nerys stood at the foot of the royal bed, her face a mask of composure that concealed emotions too complex for casual observation. After years of suffering that would have broken lesser spirits, she had achieved a kind of terrible clarity about her husband's nature and her own role in the drama he had created. She was there not as a grieving wife but as a witness to history, understanding that her presence lent legitimacy to whatever final act of destruction Aegon was preparing to unleash. Prince Aemon maintained his vigil in the white cloak that had defined his adult life, standing at attention despite the knowledge that his sworn duty to protect the royal family had become meaningless in the face of dangers that came from within rather than without. The greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms had been reduced to the role of ceremonial guard at the deathbed of a king whose greatest enemies had always been the people who loved him most. Prince Daeron occupied the position that protocol demanded for the heir apparent, but his presence in the room felt more like attendance at his own funeral than preparation for his accession to the throne. The systematic undermining of his confidence and authority had been so thorough that even he seemed to understand that his father's death would not automatically translate into his assumption of real power. He had been prepared for inheritance in the same way that a sacrifice is prepared for the altar. The bastards arranged themselves around the chamber with the easy confidence of individuals who knew that their moment of triumph was at hand. Daemon Waters stood closest to the bed, Blackfire at his side, every inch the warrior king that his father had shaped him to become. Dagger Rivers positioned himself where he could observe the reactions of the assembled lords, already calculating which would require persuasion and which would need to be eliminated in the transitions to come. Brynden Rivers seemed to fade into the shadows, his pale features and red eyes making him appear more like a spirit of vengeance than a living man. But it was the arrival of Grand Maester Orwyle with a document that had been prepared weeks in advance that signaled the beginning of the final act. The parchment, written in the king's own hand despite his physical weakness, contained words that would echo through the realm for generations to come. With the assembled witnesses watching in fascination and horror, Aegon IV formally legitimized every bastard he had ever acknowledged, transforming them from royal bastards into potential claimants to the Iron Throne itself. The pronouncement was not merely a legal document, but a declaration of war against the very concept of legitimate succession. By granting his bastards the right to bear the Targaryen name and press claims based on their royal blood, and Aegon was ensuring that his death would not bring peace, but would instead unleash conflicts that could tear the realm apart for generations. Every bastard in the room understood that they now possessed the legal standing to challenge Prince Darien's inheritance, and several of them clearly intended to do exactly that. But the legitimization was only the beginning of Aegon's final revelation. With his remaining strength, he began to speak about his legitimate son and heir in terms that removed any doubt about his true feelings regarding the succession. Before the assembled witnesses, he expressed his doubts about Daemon's parentage, suggesting that the prince might actually be the son of Prince Aemon rather than his own offspring. The accusation was delivered with the casual cruelty that had characterized his treatment of his family throughout his reign, but its implications were devastating. The suggestion that Prince Targaryen was illegitimate, while the acknowledged bastards were now legitimate effectively inverted the entire basis of royal succession. If the accusation were true, then Daemon Waters, bearer of Blackfire, would have a stronger claim to the throne than the man who had been raised as heir. If it were false, then the king had committed one final act of psychological torture against a son whose only crime had been failing to live up to impossible standards. Queen Naris received this final insult with the same dignity that she had shown throughout years of public humiliation, but those who knew her well could see the devastation in her eyes. Her husband's dying words had not merely questioned her fidelity, but had transformed her love for Aemon from something pure and noble into evidence of treason against the realm. The accusation poisoned every moment of happiness she had found in their relationship, retroactively contaminating memories that had been her only refuge from despair. Prince Aemon's reaction was perhaps the most significant of all, for his response would determine whether the accusation gained credibility or died with the king who made it. The Dragon Knight's face showed none of the outrage or denial that might have been expected from a man falsely accused of adultery with his brother's wife. Instead, there was only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this final cruelty and had already accepted whatever consequences it might bring. The assembled lords watched these revelations unfold, with the sick fascination of men witnessing a great fire that they were powerless to extinguish. They understood that they were present at a moment that would be remembered as long as the Seven Kingdoms endured, but they also recognized that their presence made them complicit in whatever disasters would follow. They had come to pay their respects to a dying king and found themselves instead serving as witnesses to the systematic destruction of everything their civilization had been built upon. Daemon Waters stepped forward as his father's voice finally failed, not to comfort a dying man but to accept the inheritance that had been prepared for him throughout his entire life. He knelt beside the bed and received the king's final words, instructions that were whispered too quietly for others to hear, but which clearly concerned the implementation of plans that had been years in the making. When he rose, it was with the confidence of a man who had just received a crown, even though the actual coronation would have to wait. King Aegon IV died as he had lived, surrounded by the wreckage of other people's lives, and confident that his vision would outlive his physical form. His final breath was drawn in a chamber filled with individuals whose futures had been shaped by his will, whose relationships had been poisoned by his manipulations, and whose very understanding of royal authority had been transformed by his example. He had not merely ruled the Seven Kingdoms, he had fundamentally altered what it meant to be a kingdom. The silence that followed his death lasted only moments before being broken by the sound of steel being drawn from sheaths, as the bastards and their supporters prepared to defend the new order that their father had created, while the legitimate heir and his few remaining allies faced the reality that their world had ended with the king's last breath. The age of Aegon the Unworthy was over, but the age of the consequences he had created was just beginning. In the distance, carried on the winter wind that rattled the windows of the Red Keep, the sound of ravens could be heard taking flight, carrying news that would reshape the political calculations of every great house in the realm. The message they bore was simple but devastating. The old world was dead, and in its place stood something that no one had been prepared for, something that would test every assumption about loyalty, honor, and the very nature of civilization itself. The immediate aftermath of Aegon's death revealed the true scope of the transformation he had accomplished, as the carefully constructed facade of royal stability collapsed to expose the fractured landscape that lay beneath. Within hours of the king's final breath, the Red Keep had effectively split into armed camps, each representing different visions of what the Seven Kingdoms should become and who possessed the legitimate authority to shape that future. Prince Daeron, now technically King Daeron II, found himself in the impossible position of claiming a throne that his own father had spent years undermining. The coronation that should have been a moment of triumph and renewal instead felt more like a funeral for the concept of legitimate succession itself. The traditional oaths of loyalty rang hollow in the throne room, spoken by lords who understood that words meant little in the new reality that Aegon had created. The young king's first acts revealed both his essential decency and his tragic unpreparedness for the challenges he faced. Rather than moving decisively to consolidate power or eliminate potential threats, Daeron attempted to heal the divisions that his father had created through reconciliation and forgiveness. He confirmed the legitimization of the bastards, hoping that generosity might prevent the civil war that everyone could sense approaching. He offered positions and honors to his half-brothers, believing that inclusion might satisfy their ambitions better than exclusion could contain them. But these gestures of reconciliation were interpreted as weakness by men who had been raised to view compassion as vulnerability and compromise as defeat. Daemon Blackfyre, as he now called himself, accepted his brother's overtures with the contempt of someone who had always known that legitimacy came from strength rather than legal documents. The sword at his side and the support of those who believed in the new order gave him power that transcended any formal recognition that Daeron might offer. The realm's response to these developments revealed how thoroughly Aegon's reign had altered the fundamental relationships that held the Seven Kingdoms together. Great houses that had served the Targaryen dynasty faithfully for generations found themselves forced to choose between competing claimants who represented entirely different concepts of royal authority. The choice was not merely between individual rulers, but between the feudal traditions that had governed Westeros since the conquest and the more absolute form of monarchy that Aegon had been constructing. Some houses, particularly those in the Reach and the Westerlands, rallied to Daeron's cause out of respect for legitimate succession and fear of the chaos that civil war would bring. Others, especially in the Riverlands where the bastards had deep connections through their mothers' families, declared for Daeron and the promise of a stronger, more centralized form of royal authority. Still others attempted to remain neutral, hoping to avoid the devastation that would inevitably follow from the conflict that was brewing. But neutrality was not truly an option in the world that Aegon had created. The intelligence networks and systems of obligation that he had constructed made it impossible for any great house to avoid involvement in the struggle that followed his death. Every lord discovered that they harbored individuals whose ultimate loyalties lay elsewhere, that their own households had been penetrated by agents of one faction or another, that the information they needed to make informed decisions was controlled by people whose interests did not align with their own. Queen Naris, now the Queen Mother, found herself in a position that was both powerless and crucial to the realm's future. The accusations that her husband had made about Daeron's parentage hung over the new king like a curse, undermining his legitimacy even among those who wanted to support him. Her own reputation for virtue, which had once been a source of suffering, became essential to her son's claim to the throne. If she was truly as pure as everyone believed, then the accusations against her were lies. But if there was any truth to her husband's final words, then the entire basis of Daeron's kingship was fraudulent. The Queen Mother's response to this impossible situation revealed the strength that years of suffering had forged within her. Rather than retreating into private grief or public denial, she chose to bear witness to the truth in the only way that seemed to matter in the world that Aegon had left behind. She submitted herself to the judgment of the faith, undergoing trials and ordeals that would either vindicate her honor or expose her guilt. The process was agonizing, but her willingness to endure it demonstrated a courage that even her enemies were forced to respect. Prince Aemon faced his own impossible choice between the competing demands of honor and survival. The accusations against him had made his position as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard untenable, but his resignation would be interpreted as an admission of guilt that would destroy both his own reputation and Daeron's claim to the throne. He chose instead to remain in his position while accepting whatever personal consequences might follow, understanding that his sacrifice might be the only thing that could preserve some semblance of legitimacy for the rightful king. The Dragon Knight's decision to stay and fight for the new king, despite the personal costs, revealed the same courage that had made him legendary as a warrior. But the battles he now faced were not against external enemies, but against the poison that his brother had injected into the very heart of the realm. Every day brought fresh challenges to his authority, new questions about his fitness to serve, and constant reminders that his own honor had become a weapon used against the king he was sworn to protect. The bastards, meanwhile, began to implement the plans that their father had spent years preparing. Daemon Blackfyre established himself in the ancestral seat of House Blackfyre, gathering around him knights and lords who believed that the realm needed a stronger hand than Daeron could provide. Aegon Rivers, now calling himself Bittersteel, began to consolidate military support in the Riverlands, using his connections through his mother's family to build an army that could challenge the royal forces. Brynden Rivers, the pale spider who controlled so many information networks, played a more subtle game, attempting to serve both the legitimate king and his own long-term interests. But perhaps the most significant development was the reaction of the common people to the crisis that was engulfing the realm. For most of Aegon's reign, the small folk had been largely unaffected by the corruption and scandal that consumed the nobility. The prosperity that his policies had created had filtered down to improve their lives in tangible ways, and they had been content to ignore the moral costs of those improvements. Now, as the realm began to slide towards civil war, they started to understand that they would pay the highest price for conflicts that they had no power to prevent. The economic disruption that followed Aegon's death was immediate and severe. Trade relationships that had been built on personal connections rather than institutional foundations collapsed when the man who had created them was no longer present to maintain them. The alternative systems of governance that had bypassed traditional authorities proved unable to function without the central figure who had held them together. The prosperity that had seemed to justify the moral compromises of the previous reign evaporated, revealing the fragility of foundations built on corruption rather than consent. As the first year of Daeron's reign progressed, it became clear that the civil war that everyone had feared was not merely possible but inevitable. The legitimization of the bastards had created too many claimants with too much support for the conflict to be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The systems that Aegon had created to maintain his own power had become obstacles to peaceful succession, generating conflicts that would have to be resolved through force rather than law. The realm that had once been united under the iron will of the Dragon Kings found itself fragmenting into competing factions that represented irreconcilable visions of the future. The age of traditional feudalism was ending, but what would replace it remained unclear. The only certainty was that the decisions made in royal bedchambers and throne rooms over the previous 12 years would determine the fate of millions of people who had never chosen to participate in the games of power that now controlled their destinies. The legacy of Aegon the Unworthy was complete. He had not merely ruled badly or died, leaving problems for his successor to solve. He had fundamentally altered the nature of royal authority and aristocratic society in ways that would take generations to fully understand. The Seven Kingdoms would never again be what they had been before his reign, and the price of that transformation would be paid in blood for decades to come. And so the tale of Aegon the Unworthy draws to its close, not with the clash of swords or the thunder of dragons, but with the quiet understanding that some legacies echo through time, long after their creators have turned to dust. In the years that followed his death, as the realm bled through 5 Blackfyre rebellions and countless smaller conflicts, historians would struggle to comprehend how one man's appetites could reshape the destiny of an entire continent. The Red Keep still stands today, its red stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain, holding within its walls the ghosts of all who walked its corridors during those transformative years. Sometimes in the deep hours before dawn, servants claim they can still hear the whisper of silk gowns in empty hallways, the echo of Queen Narys's prayers drifting from the royal sept. The Iron Throne itself seems to remember the weight of the king who sat upon it, the swords that formed its structure bearing witness to the slow corruption of everything they once protected. In the Godswood, where the ancient weirwood has watched over the castle since before the conquest, the heart tree continues its eternal vigil. Its red leaves fall and are renewed with each passing season, following cycles older than human ambition, older than the hunger for power that drove Aegon to transform a kingdom. The tree has seen kings rise and fall, has witnessed the birth of dragons and their eventual extinction, has absorbed into its ancient rings the tears of queens and the oaths of knights who believed that honor could survive any trial. The bastards scattered to their various fates, each carrying within them the seeds of the conflicts that would define the next century of Westerosi history. Daemon Blackfyre would indeed press his claim, dying on the red grass field with the sword of kings in his hand and his father's dreams of transformed monarchy bleeding into the earth beneath him. Aegon Rivers would spend decades in exile, nursing grievances that would outlive his own mortality. Brynden Rivers would serve kings faithfully and terribly, his pale eyes always watching for the next threat to the realm his father had helped to fracture. But perhaps the most poignant fate belonged to those who had suffered most during Aegon's reign, yet somehow found the strength to endure. Queen Narys, vindicated by her trials but broken by years of torment, would live only a few more years past her husband's death. Her passing was mourned throughout the realm by those who remembered what virtue looked like when it refused to compromise with evil. Prince Aemon, the perfect knight whose perfection had become a curse, would follow her to the grave shortly after, their love finally finding peace in the silence that conquers all earthly pain. King Daeron II, the Good, would spend his reign attempting to heal the wounds that his father had inflicted upon the realm. His efforts were noble and largely successful, but the fundamental changes that Aegon had wrought could never be entirely undone. The relationship between crown and nobility had been permanently altered, the concept of legitimate succession forever complicated by the precedent of legitimized bastards. Future kings would rule in the shadow of the transformation that Aegon had accomplished, their authority both strengthened and undermined by his legacy. The common people who had paid the highest price for the conflicts that royal ambition created slowly rebuilt their lives as they always had after the storms of politics passed over them. Villages destroyed in the fighting were rebuilt, fields left fallow during wartime returned to cultivation, children grew to adulthood with only stories to remind them of the chaos that had preceded their birth. In their resilience lay perhaps the only true victory over the destructive forces that Aegon had unleashed, the quiet triumph of ordinary human endurance over the extraordinary cruelties of those who claimed the right to rule. As the centuries passed and the immediate consequences of Aegon's reign faded into history, scholars would debate the true nature of his legacy. Some would argue that he had been a visionary who understood the need for stronger royal authority in an age of increasing complexity. Others would maintain that he had been nothing more than a monster whose appetites happened to serve larger historical forces. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere between these extremes, in the recognition that even the worst kings can inadvertently serve purposes larger than their own understanding. The dragons that once ruled from Dragonstone are gone now, their bones resting in the crypts beneath the Red Keep alongside the remains of the kings they once carried into battle. But their memory lingers in the blood of their descendants, in the silver hair and purple eyes that still mark the Targaryen line, in the dreams of fire and blood that visit those who carry the ancient legacy. Aegon's transformation of that legacy was perhaps his most lasting achievement, the way he proved that even dragons could be corrupted, that even the blood of old Valyria was not immune to the poisons of unchecked desire. The Iron Throne waits still, patient and eternal, for rulers worthy of the power it represents. The 1,000 swords that form its structure have tasted the blood of many kings, but they remember most clearly those who sat upon them unworthily, who used the authority they represented for purposes that diminished rather than elevated the human spirit. Future kings would learn from Aegon's example, though whether they learned to avoid his mistakes or to emulate his methods would depend upon the character of each individual who claimed the crown. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let your dreams carry you beyond the immediate tragedies of royal courts and political intrigue to the deeper truths that such stories illuminate. In the rise and fall of kingdoms, in the corruption of virtue and the persistence of hope, in the endless struggle between those who would destroy and those who would preserve, we find reflections of the eternal human condition. The tale of Aegon the Unworthy reminds us that power without wisdom is destruction, that appetite without restraint is poison, but also that even in the darkest times, courage and love can survive to inspire future generations. The stars that shone over King's Landing during Aegon's reign continue their ancient dance across the night sky, following patterns that transcend the brief span of human ambition. In their light, the struggles of kings and queens become part of a larger story, a narrative of growth and decay, creation and destruction that encompasses all of human history. The realm sleeps now under that same starlight, its people dreaming of peace while their rulers dream of power, the eternal cycle continuing as it always has and always will. Rest now, knowing that even the darkest chapters in human history eventually give way to new beginnings, that even the most corrupted kingdoms can find redemption, and that the truest victories are often won, not by those who claim thrones, but by those who preserve hope through the longest nights. The story ends, but the dream continues, carrying us forward into whatever dawn awaits beyond the darkness.